Welcome, everyone, to this fireside chat on Sudan. We're marking the 3-year mark on the war in Sudan. And it's one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world as we speak. More than 13 million people have had to leave their homes. I heard on the radio this morning that the average wage is on the level of the 90s. Poverty levels are at bottom, and also there's this general institutional collapse, and we're seeing no end to this war. Despite multiple mediation efforts, also a sustainable political solution seems out of grasp. We are here today because of the Ministerial Conference in Berlin on Sudan. And we thought that this was a good opportunity to recalibrate, to think, to also energize this process. And I think we're all facing a growing recognition that whatever we've done before didn't work and something needs to change. So the purpose of the conversation today is, first of all, to sort of unpack where's the conflict today, and also reflect a bit on this upcoming ministerial conference and pledging, and also together explore what are some realistic entry points for peace. And to do this together with me today, I'm pleased to introduce Kwesi Sonkulot-Gwynich. And Kwesi is one of our senior advisors here at Berghoff, and he's focusing exclusively on Sudan for now. Previously, Kwesi used to work for the UN World Food Programme in the Eastern Africa Regional Bureau, but also previous to that, multiple positions at DPPA. In the Horn and also in New York, and has worked extensively on mediation files. So, Kwesi, without further ado, let's dive right in. How has the conflict evolved in the past months, and what do you see as the main drivers sustaining it, not starting it, but sustaining it?
Thanks, Kristen. I think you said it really clearly in your introduction there. It's an incredible crisis in terms of scale and proportion. We've seen a number of changes as the conflict has gone on. I guess most recently has been the shift in fighting. We've seen an increase in human suffering. We've got around, as you said, 14 million people displaced either in Sudan or in neighboring states. We've got around 19 million school children who are out of school. So it's around the same size population as the entire school population of Germany that is now out of school in Sudan. So this is really a crisis of incredible magnitude. What we've seen recently is shifts in terms of not only the battlefield shifts as they ebb and flow in Sudan, but also on the strategies. And unfortunately, we've seen tactics in terms of use of drone strikes. We've seen the crisis and ethnic cleansing in Fashir that have led to huge displacement of populations and huge displacements of people's livelihoods. I think what has been sustaining this conflict, and I think you also said it yesterday in one of our other meetings, is this really perverse form of localization, where what is turning into a global regional conflict is also meshing with a number of local conflicts in Sudan. Some have described Sudan as Africa's Second World War. If the war in the Congo was the first in the 90s, Sudan is definitely Africa's Second World War, where neighboring states are involved, states from outside of the region are involved, and we've got a level of intermeshing between local conflicts and global conflicts now, with the war in Iran being one of them, that makes mediation particularly difficult in Sudan. But it also means that the conflict has achieved a level of violence that is also perhaps unheard of in the Sudanese context, unfortunately.
Wow. So I have this feeling about this conflict that we're witnessing this crazy recurring pattern in Sudan. Like conflict or violence will erupt. International mediators will sort of launch a flurry of initiatives, and then they stall or are ignored. And then there's a pause. And then everything happens again, and people just do the same thing over and over again. same actors who already undermined previous efforts. And it's this incessant cycle, and it doesn't see what needs to happen to break that cycle.
Yeah, I think this is one of the hopes of many who are focusing on the upcoming meeting in Berlin tomorrow. The fear is that we've seen these cycles of what some would call zombie mediation, where we resurrect old patterns, we resurrect old bodies, we resurrect the same individuals from before, and we continue kind of in a trance towards an outcome that is unachievable.
I've never heard that, zombie mediation. Wow.
The real challenge here is that in order to have sustainable peace in Sudan, it requires deep reflection by the Sudanese and by international mediators for a sustainable peace. It requires deconstructing some of the challenges that Sudan has faced since independence, some would argue even before, the inequalities between the center and the periphery, the pattern of reinstituting peace agreements that bring together the conflict parties, the two belligerents in this case, is one that perhaps will not work here. We need a deeper structural fit for Sudan. And I think that is what many are hoping for, that this conference in Berlin signals that the international community is behind the Sudanese civilians in their push for deep structural change, the only thing that can lead to a sustainable peace now. So it's less about the mediation efforts and the stopping and starting of them, but rather that they weren't fit for purpose. None of them really looked to really understand what was happening and how do we rebuild the Sudan in some way, or how do we support Sudanese to rebuild the Sudan in a way that is more just and more equitable for Sudanese. Because at the root of it, this is what the conflicts in Sudan are about. They're about a lack of equality. They're about a lack of inclusion and lack of recognition of Sudan's diversity, and an exclusion of those who are from the periphery. So this is one in a series of conflicts that Sudan has faced in South Sudan, in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains. Now this more national conflict, but with the same root causes.
So if you enter the civilians, that's what the civilians are saying, that's what they want. But if you look at the belligerents, are those the same root causes that are, isn't it just that they want power?
Well, yes, I think for the belligerents in Sudan are multiple. They are a series of alliances, both on the side of SAF, the army, and on the side of the RSF, with not all of them having the same objectives or even having started the conflict for the same reason. So there are some who are definitely, it is the old-fashioned greed and grievance kind of pushes for them. Others are movements that have been fighting for decades for your autonomy, that have joined either side because they feel this is a way for them to stake their claim, but also to defend their territories and the populations that are under their control. So multiple reasons for joining the war, but of course, yes, they are those that are simply about greed and grievances.
So multiple grievances or multiple factors and multiple actors in Sudan waging war, but on the mediation side, there are also multiple initiatives and also multiple actors, right? So all of these parallel initiatives, we have the Quad, we have the Quintet, we have the AU-led process, the Egyptian-led process, we have the Alps previously. All of these tracks, how can we in the international community actually ensure that it's coordinated and complementary rather than competitive?
I think so far we haven't seen the level of complementarity needed between the processes. In fact, the processes themselves have been part and parcel of the problem. They have allowed for phone shopping. They have allowed for stopping and starting of the process in a way that has led the conflict to escalate at particular times as belligerent parties seek to have gains before the next round of talks. So I think what many are hoping for at the outcome of this Berlin meeting is that we will have agreement on a more structured process, if not a single process, but at least some complementarity between the main processes. There is the hope that the Quad process with the Americans, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, and the Saudis will come more in line with the process that's being put together now by the Quintet, which are the five international multilaterals. Where the other processes like APS and others will fit into those, I think there's still time for that to be sorted out. But the idea that we would have this many processes is perhaps a little bit problematic at this point in time. The hope of many Sudanese is that we would have a single process with a single mediator with all of the others falling in line under that,
Mhm.
and for that to then be the main forum to address the longer term issues once you have a ceasefire.
But do you think that's realistic?
I think yes. I think the challenge that we have now is that we've got a Quad process that is focusing on the ceasefire, and I think that is perhaps sensible because the actors there who have the most influence over the belligerent parties are in the Quad process. The challenge has always been, or the fear, I guess, has always been amongst Sudanese and some international community, is that because of this kind of zombie mediation and the tiredness with it, that a quick fix will be sought and a quick fix that will simply take us back 3 years ago with the two belligerent parties and their leaders back in power. So the hope is that the quintet process or whichever mediation process focuses on the political can look at the deeper structural causes, have a process that brings Sudanese together from all spectrums of Sudan, all spectrums of life, all political spectrums, geographic diversity, and more importantly, including youth and women, to try to create a process that is now a bit more sustainable and it looks at really delving into the root causes of these various conflicts in Sudan.
It's so interesting that you would mention also youth and women and I mean also broader inclusivity because if you look at Sudan and the sort of cycle of conflict, it's also not unique to Sudan. We can see that in many other countries on the African continent, not least, but also elsewhere, that you have the belligerents who are armed, and then you have perhaps maybe external actors supporting the armed factors, armed groups, and that it's always this, and you reference that the sort of short-term security thinking, but that then it often excludes the civilian voices. It excludes also perhaps a vision for a future Sudan. Like what kind of society should Sudan be for all its inhabitants? But and again we see this, and I know you've worked on many other peace processes, and because of the stress of the short term, we need a deal, and we'll deal with the civilians later. That's often what we hear. But what can be done to break that pattern? Because there, of course, we want to end the violence and we want to end it now because people are de facto suffering. But then, in order to have this more long-term, more inclusive political settlements, it can't be on the short term. So how do we square that circle?
And I think this is where we need to support the Sudanese the most. I think the Sudanese are very clear in this idea that these short-term fixes will not work. We need to amplify their voices. And I'm very proud that at Berghoff, what we're doing is trying to help those civilians to come to singular opinions or at least consensus opinions on some of these broad issues, as you said, as to what is the Sudan that we want to live in the future. How can we help them get these ideas together clearly and coherently? And how do we help them transmit these ideas to the various mediation processes? One of the challenges, of course, is that there is no hall big enough in either Addis Ababa or here in Berlin that can hold the breadth of Sudanese political opinion. So how do we also help the mediators ensure that when they do bring participants to these meetings, when they do bring stakeholders together, that they have got the widest spectrum of Sudanese society, the widest spectrum of opinions, and that this means that we won't have people who feel that they are left out or parties who can then become spoilers for the next round. So I think this is really key to this, is that how do we include as many Sudanese voices as possible, and how do we as mediation support actors ensure that these voices are coming to the mediation and coming to the mediators from a position of consensus.
So you're saying in a way that organizations such as our own can work on some parallel tracks. First of all, supporting Sudanese voices or people, but then in a way also being the bridge or translator and supporting the mediators to better understand the issues of inclusion.
Yeah, and I think that we need to remember that the organizations involved in the Sudan process, this is not their only mediation track or effort at this point in time. Many are also involved on Iran, they're involved in other conflicts on the African continent. So the ability of gray matter to focus on Sudan for an extended period of time is somewhat limited. So I think we as mediation support actors like Berghoff are in a position where we can support some of those initiatives. But more importantly, we can also support the Sudanese in ensuring that their voices are heard at these forums. And this is, I think, what we're doing in quite a number of our programs.
I have to ask you because I mean I've also worked a lot in the past on women, peace and security in mediation and also sort of the inclusion issue. But a lot of in different conflicts, a lot of women are saying that we're only asked to participate if we speak about women's issues, not about ceasefires, for example. And sometimes, or as actors or in their own constituencies, political parties, etc. But at least for, I mean, on the Iran war, we're not hearing the word women at all, but on Sudan, we actually are a lot. I mean, there are also very high levels of sexual violence in Sudan. But if you think about everything we've learned about the inclusion of women in other processes, what can we perhaps what can we use for the example of Sudan? And what are the key barriers for Sudanese women to actually enter these spaces?
I mean, first of all, maybe we acknowledge the huge burden that Sudanese women have carried over the past 3 years and before that in previous conflicts from Darfur, Kordofan, and other places. Right now, what is holding Sudan together are the emergency responders, the local initiatives, and the Sudanese, particularly the Sudanese women. They're the ones who are on the front line holding Sudan together at this point in time. I think that they occupy a wide plethora of places within the Sudanese society and Sudanese spectrum. So you have women leaders of political parties, you have women who are heads of emergency response rooms and self-help groups, you have women who are working with victims of sexual violence in Al-Fashir and other locations. So they occupy this incredibly wide spectrum. The challenge, of course, is that when it comes to political talks and political negotiations, the group that will be brought to that is incredibly narrow. The political parties themselves, some of them may not have women in senior positions. So there is this constant debate. I think it's not only in Sudan, we find it also in places as far as with Sri Lanka and also in Latin America around whether we need a dedicated space and a dedicated track for women, where women's issues can be discussed, where they can coalesce and then be brought into the main mediation process as clear recommendations, or whether women should sit at the table in the main process. There are some women, some Sudanese women themselves, who feel that in the main process, their issues will be diluted. The main process is a place for compromise, and on women's issues, there should be no compromise. So we've got this challenge. I think there's no right answer to this.
Can't we have both?
I think we should. I think we should have both. I think we should have clearly designated spaces for women where women can support each other, work together on clearly articulating their issues. And I think in addition to that, women should also be at the main table, pushing women's issues, but also pushing national issues with the perspective as how these will impact on women. One example that I keep coming back to is around DDR.
Mm-hmm.
We've had many experiences yourself in Sierra Leone, Liberia, in the Mano River area, and in other contexts where women are not classified as fighters when they're particularly when they're in resistance movements or non-state armed groups. They are camp followers. When you have the DDR process, the first people who are DDR'd with the smallest packages or those who are sent into positions where they will have no authority are the women. So I think for the Sudanese context, we really need to look at what has happened previously in other processes, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and see what we can help the Sudanese to bring to the mediators and say, look, this has worked, this has not worked, this will not work in our context. So this is something as well that as Berghoff we're supporting on, and how do we bring these ideas together around some of the critical issues around the peace process, be they ceasefire, be they DDR, be there women's participation in post-conflict parliaments and post-conflict political life.
Mm. And going off script here a bit, but in this conference in Berlin, I know that there will be a lot of Sudanese people. It's not just a ministerial from European and other governments, right? I mean, there will be Sudanese people here to voice their concerns and their needs. And there will be women in this group, I am assuming.
I think we have to tip our hats to the quintet in terms of the effort that they've put in. Within the Berlin meeting will have 3 components: a ministerial meeting, there will be a humanitarian pledging conference, and there is a civilian space. And within that civilian space, I think a lot of effort has gone into including youth and women. or making sure that youth and women are represented there. So I think the initial idea was to have a large contingent of women representing women civil society, women-led organizations, organizations that focus on women, the same for the youth, and the same for the emergency response room. So I think they are well represented in the meeting in that civilian space. I guess the question becomes, what is the consensus position between that block of civil society and the political actors who are being invited? I think right now, the actual outcomes of the Berlin meeting will be muted. There will be a ministerial paper. There will also be a joint position by the civilian actors. I think what's more important is what comes next. This signals a refocusing of international attention on Sudan. The hope then is that through the quintet, the quad, and other processes, they're able to pick up the threads from Berlin and craft a new process that is more inclusive, and one that where women's voices and youth voices can bubble to the surface.
So you were seeing the Berlin conference not just as it's more of a stepping stone to the next process. Our expectations of what this conference actually will deliver is limited, or I mean, we hope, of course, that pledging for humanitarian pledging will be grand, but what are our expectations? What do you expect from the conference itself?
Well, I think, yes, I think on the humanitarian side, there's a hope that there will be supplemental funds for humanitarian assistance. The key focus of the conference, and I think the key focus of humanitarian assistance in Sudan over the last 3 years, has been the mutual aid space. So the emergency response rooms, the local responders. So I think the theme of the conference is, how do we as international actors support those frontline actors who are at risk of not only violence, but also detention by the belligerent parties? How do we support them? So I think one is the pledging on that. And I think second, of course, is the start or the signaling of the movement along a political process that the quintet will convene for the Sudanese.
I mean, I know you can't see into the future, but given what you know today, what do you think are like plausible scenarios in the coming 6 to 12 months for Sudan?
I think it's very difficult to say. I think much of this depends on how the dust settles in the Persian Gulf. What happens there? I think the linkages between these conflicts are quite strong. I think it depends on where the quintet process goes and how it builds momentum. I think the Americans are working on a ceasefire via the Quad. Hopefully there will be an announcement soon, and hopefully that this will be something that is actually implementable. I think that's another key challenge. We've had a history in the Sudan of belligerent parties signing on to agreements, ceasefires, pauses, humanitarian truce, not only in this conflict, but also in previous conflicts, and where they don't actually implement that. So we've had kind of serial signatures, but no implementation. So it will depend on some of these factors, whether there is implementation of a ceasefire that happens, how the quintet process comes together, and then what happens in the Persian Gulf will kind of dictate where things go in Sudan. But I think in spite of that, one thing we know is that Sudanese civilians will continue to do the incredible work they've done, providing assistance to those in need and pushing for the political process to be one that is more inclusive.
It's daunting, but it's so necessary. I think last question, and you don't have to have I'm not expecting you to have the answer, but we often speak about ripeness, right? Like the belligerent parties have to believe that they can't win the war in order for peace negotiations to be possible, right? Like there has to be another option out. But do you think we're there now? Is there ripeness in this conflict, or could someone nudge that ripeness a bit?
Yeah, I think in the Caribbean and Guyana, where I'm from, when fruit is not ripe, we put it in a bucket of rice to ripen it. So the question is, where is the bucket of rice for Sudan? How do we ripen this moment? One of the things that this meeting in Berlin will focus on is on de-escalation. And the idea, of course, is that having either shuttle talks or having proximity talks is quite difficult when the rhetoric in the media, when some of the attacks are at their height. So could they get commitment from the belligerent parties to de-escalate some of this? And this would be the beginning. It may not be the entire bucket of rice, but it might be enough to start to ripen the process, is the hope.
Wow, I will never forget that, the bucket of rice in peace mediation. Thank you, Kwesi. We're gonna now have some questions from the audience, which are sent to me on my phone. Let me see. So one, I don't know who sent it, but thank you for sending this question. Kwesi, I'll do it like two or three questions. There's an assumption that external actors should include more civil society to tables, and this would automatically improve the results. So that's the assumption. However, looking at Sudan and other contexts, it rarely worked. What's your perspective? And the next one is, what may Germany do to support the integration of women's agenda in the conference and the ongoing political and mediation processes? We'll stop there for now.
Let me start with the inclusion of civil society. I think there is rhetoric that Sudanese political parties, Sudanese civil society are divided. This is the rhetoric that is out there. You could turn that rhetoric on Guyana, you could turn it on Germany. Political parties are supposed to be divided. They're supposed to come with different opinions. Civil societies occupy different roles. What unites them, what unites a large chunk of Sudanese political parties and the entirety of Sudanese civil society, is calling for an end to this war and calling for a just and inclusive peace. So I think even though it's difficult to include them in these spaces sometimes in terms of the configuration and because of that diversity, all peace processes that have included women and that have included civil society voices have been more durable than those who do not. The belligerents have specific needs that largely focus on gains after the fighting ends, where civil society, women's groups, and youth usually include issues that are more broadly around constitutional change, more broadly around creating a more inclusive society. So this is why, as difficult as it is to include all perspectives, it's usually best if the mediators can.
And I mean, you also referenced the durability. I mean, there is actually research on this, not just on women's inclusion, but civil society inclusion, that they last longer, and they have many more provisions in the agreements that benefit civilians. So it's not that it has never worked. It has actually showed us that it does work.
Yeah, empirical evidence, to support that.
And then we had the one on Germany. What can Germany do?
I think Germany is in an interesting position now as hosts of this conference. The hope, I guess, is that Germany uses this spotlight and this position to push for more women's inclusion. There are concrete needs of women in all spaces in Sudan, both in terms of humanitarian space. There's a need for support in terms of protection of civilians and support to those who have experienced or are working with those who experience sexual and gender-based violence. In the political space, I guess the question for Germany is, how do they support those women who are either part of the talks or who should be included in the talks? Now, is this through trying to have the quintet open the space more to women? Is this providing capacity building for women in armed movements or women in political parties so that they're able to take part in these talks? There are a number of roles that Germany can play that I think are quite important, but I think this conference being held in Berlin provides a huge opportunity for Germany to step up to the plate here on this role.
I think a lot will, as you said, we will see. We have to sort of follow up really after the conference, and the conference will generate momentum and visibility on Sudan, but then it's also up to us to maybe also have these conversations with the quintet and with donors such as Germany. Okay, I have a few more. Why has the protection of civilians failed in Sudan? What could be done to deliver justice to the victims of war? That's the first one. And then there's one, do you see any role for religious actors in the peace process in Sudan?
Let me start with the second one. Religious actors, traditional leaders in Sudan occupy a particular space as Ajawid or mediators in Sudan. They have a long tradition of this in many parts of Sudan. Many of the local ceasefires that we've had in Sudan that have worked have been done by religious leaders and by people from what they call native administration, traditional leaders. The challenge has been, how do you insulate these agreements and these people from national conflicts and from international conflicts? In many cases, these ceasefires and agreements fail not because of the parties on the ground, but because national actors and international actors either stirred the pot or needed the conflict to continue in some ways. So the question becomes, how do we support these local level initiatives? How do we reach those with credibility, and how do we ensure that they're able to fulfill their role as peace actors? One of the changes, I guess, also in this conflict has been that many of these systems of traditional mediation are designed for conflicts that are on a much smaller scale than the one we have in Sudan. So there is a need for some upskilling of these actors. There is a need for kind of connecting these to wider processes, but there is a strong tradition in Sudan of this that is still functioning currently in Sudan.
But it's a scaling in a way, and insulating.
Yes, so we need to scale and insulate these.
On the victims.
On the victims and protection of civilians, I think this is really the tragedy of the Sudanese conflict. I think from the beginning of the conflict, what we saw in Jenin, recently what we've seen in Al-Fashir, we've seen a willingness by the belligerent parties to engage in all manner of violations of IHL, all manners of violation of women's bodies and of even sacred spaces. So I think this is one that the international community has struggled with and will continue to struggle with. Sudan is a vast country. Having boots on the ground in the way that it was done in Bosnia, peacekeeping has changed. It's wrapping up in the UN in some ways. And I think this is why the Quad has put such hope on a ceasefire. The hope that with a ceasefire, you'll be able to do some monitoring of this, at least on the contact lines, and that in other areas, you'll be able to have provisions in place to if not protect civilians, at least monitor violations. Unfortunately, I think without a comprehensive cessation of hostilities or humanitarian pause, it will be very difficult to enforce any kind of protection of civilians.
And I mean, as you rightly said, Sudan is so vast as well. So, I mean, how do you in effect really monitor when it's so huge, unless you have the local populations be part of that monitoring, perhaps?
Exactly. This will be the only way to do it in Sudan. It will be the same women's groups, it will be the same civil society actors who will have to monitor in large parts any ceasefire that's put in place at this point in time.
But the violations you mentioned, I mean, they're immense. It's the human suffering is more than we can even comprehend. But and then you have this sense of like the impunity, like will there be justice? Even can there be a just war after? And what can the Sudanese actors, civilian organizations do?
What we're hearing from Sudanese is actually reflects the kind of duality of this entire problem. There are some who are hard-nosed and some who are saying that in the end, we will have to have some kind of reconciliation because the scale of the crimes is too much, and because any kind of punitive justice measure may not be what the society needs. On the other hand, you have those who are saying maybe it's because we haven't had justice for previous crimes, previous violations in the Nuba Mountains in Darfur that we're facing this again now.
Yeah.
So maybe this is the time to actually have comprehensive investigations and justice for what has taken place, particularly in Fashir and Jenin, but also throughout the country in the last 3 years.
And because you mentioned it, it's not just this war, 3 years. There have been many wars before. So we're also talking about intergenerational trauma of the whole population who were born and have grown up and are then perpetuating conflict, perhaps. So that's another issue, of course. That's massive. We have one question here from Eric Matt from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung and NZZ. I'm particularly interested in the fact that RSF and SAF aren't involved in Berlin. On the one hand, one could argue that it's long overdue to move away from the warring parties and towards those who truly want peace. On the other hand, history, for example, the Taliban and Afghanistan, show that peace is rarely achieved when those actors are excluded. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I think the setup of Berlin is really focused on the civilians. The belligerents have their own space and their own mediation process, which is the Quad. Berlin isn't designed to be a mediation, but rather it's designed to be a space where civilians can come together and put forward their requests in terms of the humanitarian and show a united face to the international community around the long-term settlement of the conflict. So I think I agree, yes, excluding belligerents would not work. They aren't excluded. This is just a particularly niche form for civilians at this particular point in time. But a very good question nonetheless.
But that is actually what makes the Quad and the Quintet fairly unique, I would say. I mean, if you look at others, because they have been so only focused on the belligerents, right? And then now you actually have another process that's focused, but then it's the coordination between them that we're sort of waiting for and see what will happen. This sort of the grand design of a peace process.
And I think this is where efforts will sink or swim. Here on how do you link. The other challenge, and I guess the other fear, is that one of these processes gets too far ahead of the other. So how do you include a feedback mechanism that means that commitments made by the belligerents in terms of ceasefires or standing down or cantonment don't conflict with what is being discussed with civilians on the long-term settlement of Sudan? How do you ensure that commitments made to the belligerents in terms of their future doesn't impact on the red lines of civilians and what they're willing to accept? So I think there will have to be a lot of give and take between these two processes. We hope that the architecture is solid and that the feedback mechanism between the two is something that is stable and something that's being focused on between both the Quintet and the Quad at this point in time.
Not to mention all the others.
And all the others, yes.
Okay, I have two additional questions for now. One is, it was interesting because you did mention like sort of local mediation inside mediators, but this question is one you recognize. Is it possible to support African solutions to African problems in Sudan? And what might they be? And the other one is actually the other side. How can international actors better support inclusive and locally grounded peace efforts?
I think it's at this point in time, we've seen in the same way we've seen a convergence of local, national, and international conflicts in Sudan, perhaps the best approach is a convergence of national, local, and international mediation efforts. So this would go beyond African solutions to African problems or African challenges. Sudan is now one that brings in the Gulf actors, it brings in North Africa, it brings in West Africa, the Sahel. So I think the architecture that's needed for this is one that goes beyond some of this. And I think this is what they're trying to do with the Quintet, bringing together a number of multilateral organizations with mandates that cover the wide spectrum of the parts of the conflict in Sudan. I guess the second question there on international support to these efforts, it is really to support the mediators and the responders. I think the challenge now is identifying what is happening, where you may have breakthroughs. The question is, can this all be coordinated by a single mediation process? Probably not. We will probably have a number of mediations, one on the national scale, while we have local mediators continuing to bring local level peace, everyday peace, in the areas where they operate. And that is where actors on the ground, where governments like Germany and others can support those local efforts, both in terms of financing, but also in terms of, as we mentioned before, kind of insulating them from what is taking place on the national level and upscaling and upskilling when that's necessary.
And I mean, that is in a way the way we think also on multi-track, like how do you link those processes, like the very high level and with the work of the insider mediators, for instance. But then I assume that actors such as Germany, who are actually then funding maybe insider mediators, that's the link also to, because they are then part of the European Union, and maybe they have their own stakes in the high level mediation. So that could be an option.
Yeah, and I think because Sudan is multiple conflicts all folded up together, one mediation effort, even at a national ceasefire, you will still have local conflicts that will need to be resolved, perhaps at a level that is too far removed from the Quintet and the Quad, but at a level where governments like Germany and others may be able to support inside mediators to work on those conflicts and bring some settlements.
Yeah, because also what you said there earlier, it's not really no longer it's not an African problem, to be fair, because it's a geopolitical conflict that takes place in Sudan to
some extent, yes.
To some extent. Okay, I think we have to wrap up. Kwesi, thank you so much for all the work you do and for taking the time to meet the audience today. I know we had like almost 300 registered. Don't know exactly how many showed up, but thank you so much for spending some time with us. And I hope the conversation inspires and that you think now, after the Berlin conference, what you can do to improve this. Some of the takeaways for me is still that this is such a complex and entrenched conflict. I mean, we just have to, this is what it is. And what you said, that sort of all the international efforts need more coordination. And we can also play a part in that, so obviously. I also heard you say a lot that just a ceasefire won't do it. You know, it really needs to be a sort of a top-down, bottom-up process, and where inclusion and sort of the will of the Sudanese people are represented. Yeah, so the call for action to end this conversation is for this ministerial in Berlin to focus on how to make peace more locally grounded. Thank you so much.